Welcome to READ, the Research, Education, and Advocacy podcast. READ connects you with researchers, educators, and thought leaders on current research and best practices in education and child development. READ is produced by the Windward Institute. I'm your host, Danielle Gomez, and I'm so excited. The WI is celebrating its 5-year anniversary, which means that READ is now turning 5. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where the time has gone, but I couldn't have imagined a better way to celebrate the 5-year anniversary than being joined by our friend, Dr. Devin Kearns. Dr. Kearns, welcome to the READ podcast.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Good to see you, as always. I would say welcome, but it's more of a welcome back. You were on episode 5 of READ, which was called Back to the Classroom, which we recorded in November of 2019 in person.
Oh my gosh, in person. Yes.
Like, I don't even know where the time went. I mean, I've seen you a bunch of times since, but I just can't imagine us being here. Like, I feel like we were in a blip, you know?
It's very, very strange, but it's very exciting that you guys did 5 years. Congratulations on that amazing achievement. It's been a really amazing podcast series you all done. There have been so many amazing guests and so much that everyone has learned. I know the field has really benefited. So thank you all for what you did to make this happen and get us all through the pandemic and beyond.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And I'd like to know, I mean, we presented your formal bio back when we recorded in 2019. I know a lot has changed. So I want to give you the floor. I want to know where you are in the world.
Sure.
And, you know, tell us more about your story from that moment to where we are today across a journey of a pandemic and beyond.
Well, so I stayed in Connecticut for most of the pandemic, working at the University of Connecticut. This year, though, I made a move to North Carolina. So I now work at North Carolina State University at Raleigh. And I am here because I was offered the opportunity to apply for a position as the Goodnight Distinguished Professor in Early Literacy. It's a really cool position. It was funded by Anne and Jim Goodnight, who are benefactors of the state of North Carolina and put a lot of effort into helping improve the outcomes in literacy for North Carolina children. And they funded this position and others like it across the state to try to make a big difference in outcomes for kids in North Carolina and to help higher education make some changes as well. And I applied for the job, was offered the job and accepted the job, and I'm now here in North Carolina and still doing the same work. I continue to focus on how to improve outcomes for kids with and arrested reading disabilities. And a lot of my emphasis is still on designing and implementing systems for improving outcomes for kids. So, you know, how can we use data effectively and regularly to improve the quality of the instruction we provide? So I've been working for the past several years on projects across the state of Connecticut, doing that, and then working in school districts across the country to do that as well. So that's been the most exciting work that I've done. I'm also starting some new endeavors into teaching computers to read and then seeing how we can it's been kind of cool, and seeing how we can use the data we produce from those to see if we can test reading interventions without having to actually go to schools, which sounds strange, but I think it's possibly quite cool.
I'm curious, do computers also benefit from explicit systematic instruction?
We think the answer is yes. We actually would not be the first to demonstrate that, actually. There are computer simulations from back in the early 2000s where they actually taught a computer to read using letter sound correspondences. And they found that the computers learned to read when you did that. And so our work is actually an extension of that kind of work. What I've been doing with my colleague, Matt Cooper-Borgenhagen at Florida State, and Elfrieda Hebert, who has her own company, Text Project, and Nathan Kroc, who's also Florida State. We've been working on building this model that can read really long words as well as short words. So historically, they couldn't read long words, these models. And so you could do some basic tests, but you couldn't have it read like real books. Well, this model can read books. So now what we can do is we can actually not only test like, can it read the words when we give it letter sounds, we can also find out what happens if we have the computer read different kinds of books. So we're having computers read decodable books and read non-decodable books and seeing what the outcomes are. So that's pretty cool. I don't have great results for you yet because we're still working on it, but we presented some of that work for the first time at the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading conference this past summer, and people were pretty excited. We are too.
That's interesting. Yeah, I love that. Can you also, what's the word I'm thinking out? Not navigate, but I guess intervene with the actual computer itself to test like learner variability? Like, could you create a scenario, for example, of a child with dyslexia or a child with DLD and things like that?
Yeah, you absolutely can. That's one of the really amazing things about these computer simulations is you can actually, it's all network, right? And so you can
Mhm.
change the part of the network that does sound processing. So you can actually make the network process sounds less efficiently in a
Yeah.
variety of different ways. And so you can do that. You can create impairments in the quality of the network's knowledge of meaning, right? So you can
Mhm.
actually simulate a learner that doesn't know much about words or know much about language, and you can see what the outcome is on reading. You can
That,
simulate like when kids are inattentive even, you can simulate when they have difficulty learning. These simulations are pretty robust, and Mark Seidenberg, who has done work on this for decades, and his some of his work, has helped push the field forward in thinking about how letters and sounds and meaning go together. And we're really extending that and hopefully going to be able to turn it into something practical where we can actually do some tests of interventions without actually going to schools. Obviously, we care most about being in schools, but it's
yeah.
expensive to test these things. And we think it'd be really cool to be able to do some kind of preliminary tests just using computers as learners.
Yeah. I mean, data, that's what a great way to gather a group of data, right? And like you said, to test these things before working with students. It's really fascinating. Now I want to pivot and just talk more about that, but I want to stay the course with 5 years of,
Okay.
of the Read podcast.
Sure.
You're an innovator. I mean, I know that you've really benefited us at the Windward School and the Windward Institute as a member of our advisory board, as a former community lecturer, as just that critical friend, that colleague, that expert that we always seem to turn to when we have a question. So we really appreciate that. I mean, you received the John J. Russell Advocacy Award last year.
Good.
And I say all these things because I do value all the expertise that you bring. And I couldn't think of anyone else except for you to talk about the reflections in the science of reading. And so I kind of want to think more, maybe in the last 5 years, but even if we want to go beyond, there's been a lot in the science of reading that has captured our attention over the last few years. And so, in your reflections about the last few years in the science of reading, what themes have you noticed have emerged in the research and in education that you're seeing in these last couple of years?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think that's really heartening is I do think that people are taking science really seriously. There are a number of controversies that I've had the fortune or misfortune to be involved in and talk about, things about whether we should teach kids syllable division, whether we should teach kids to do phonological awareness with or without letters, how much decodable text reading should we do? I mean, I somehow decided that I should just ask questions nobody really wants you to answer because nobody likes the answers when they come out. But what I will say in doing that is, particularly when I think about the phonological awareness work is, that was really heated for a bit, right? And people, I mean, it seems like a really silly thing for the less initiated. Basically, people have been arguing about whether or not you should teach kids, phonological awareness with letters. Could you use like tiles or something like that to support it? Or should you only do oral exercise? Or should you have a role that have oral exercises only as a primary component? And people have argued about this a lot, and it's been sort of ugly, which for the totally uninitiated cannot imagine why anyone would argue about whether or not to use letter tiles or something like that. But, one of the things I've noticed there is that I anticipated this would just be this long thing that no one would ever kind of we never sort of start to get out of. But what I have noticed is that there's been more willingness for people to think about the possibility that maybe letters can help than I anticipated, right? Especially in the last year or so, I've seen less discussion where people are just so um, passionately arguing that you shouldn't ever use letters than I would have expected historically, and I think that's a credit to the field that people are actually listening to data a little bit. That people are even challenging their own assumptions, because I do think one of the things about the science of reading that I think will make it last, if it does, and I really do hope that it does, is that if we're scientific, it will last.
Yeah.
That, in other words, we can't just sort of cherry pick and be like, I like that. That seems scientific. Let's go with it. Or that's what, we used to do and it seemed like a good idea. No, I think people are actually following the science. And I think that if we continue to do that, science can win, because, I think we are in an era where there's been pushback on the science of reading, people saying it's, short-sighted and inadequate. And I think that that's wrong, because it's often based on incomplete understanding of what reading science is. But the best way we can fight back against that is to be scientific. And I think we are. So I think that's a trend I've noticed over the past 5 years that I think is really, really, really exciting.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say this, when I was at the Haskins Global Literacy Hub conference last year in 2023, what I really appreciated was this testing of assumptions and the clarification from when, you and Dr. Mark Seidenberg spoke, and Dr. Landy and a number of others. And I think that was, on top of mind, is to celebrate all the work that's been done, and also know that because there are certain questions that still need to be unanswered doesn't mean any of the work that's been done is wrong. It's just that we're broadening our understanding of reading science to make ultimately, hopefully, educators and better, and kids, hopefully, their literacy outcomes improving. So I appreciate your reflection on that.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's an exciting time to be doing this work, because I think that a lot of people are really thinking about science in the right way, and there are a lot of people who still aren't. But I feel really heartened by that. So that's a big trend. So
you said in the beginning that you work a lot with educators in North Carolina, Connecticut, across the country. Has the world reached? Have you gone to talk to educators around the world yet?
I have not done as much international work as I would like. I visited Ethiopia last January, met with a colleague, Bayo Mesale Makonnen, and he works at Addis Ababa University. And he and I have been working on a project. We're planning to put some sort of peer assisted learning strategies into schools. Yeah, we applied for a grant that we didn't get funded, but we're going to resubmit, and we're going to collect some pilot data on that before we resubmit. And so that's, but I haven't worked extensively in the country. He and I just kind of did some initial discussions, and I got to see kind of literacy across the country. There's a lot of need for literacy improvement there across the world as well. But so, yeah, I'm excited to go other places more. So if, there are international listeners who might be interested to share with me things that are going on in their country, and other orthographies too. English is obviously near and dear to my heart, but I really enjoy understanding how, reading works in other languages, and would be thrilled to visit other places. I have a paper, one of my doctoral students when I was at Boston University, her first language was Arabic. She was from Saudi Arabia. And so I actually have a paper on Arabic word reading. Yeah, and I should be clear, I don't speak Arabic, but she does. And, there are many fascinating things about Arabic, which has some similarities to Hebrew and the way the language works, that are really interesting. And so, many languages have kind of their own sort of unique things that make them easier or harder to learn. And so anyway, so I'd be thrilled to visit other places to do that. I really want to do that. I think it's important to bring scientific principles to other places, and to take the good things that we've learned and to support, countries at all, points along the development scale and improving things.
Yeah, I love that. I think, in your work with educators, my question will be related to themes that you're noticing with educators, but I will make this caveat. The Read podcast is listened to in 6 continents. We haven't reached Antarctica yet. So maybe if you train computers, you can train penguins. I'm not sure, maybe, but, and if you do want to bring the good work to Antarctica with whatever whoever lives there, that would be exciting.
That would be exciting.
So, putting that out there to the I think 145 countries that listen.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So, but In your work with educators, what themes have you specifically noticed in terms of maybe the progress that educators have been making or the continued need that seems to be existing in the field?
Yeah, I think that a big need I see is around database decision making.
Mm-hmm.
So I think overall instruction is improving in early literacy. And there are still, though, lots of kids who aren't making adequate progress. Those are the kids who have the level of need that makes them good candidates for their Windward school, right? They go there because they aren't making adequate progress without the supports that you all can provide. I've been privileged to visit Windward multiple times, and I know the amazing things that the kids are learning there. And, some kids really need that additional support. But a couple of things happen. One thing that happens is it gets missed sometimes because people aren't looking carefully enough at the data. And so still, to my great surprise, there are kids in fifth grade who are just being identified with disabilities in reading. And you just think, how is this possible? This kid is reading, like 40 words a minute in fifth grade or less. And you think, this kid's reading 150 words a minute. How did this happen? And what happens, I think, a lot of times is people aren't focused enough on the data continuously, so they'll look at screening scores at the beginning of the year and the kid is, pretty far behind, but then somebody thinks they'll catch up and they put them in some sort of, supported intervention. I don't want to assume too much knowledge on the part of the listeners, but, there's this idea of like tier 2 supports, which is like supplemental support for kids who aren't doing well in regular instruction. And a lot of schools will use this kind of tier 2 support, this extra level of support, to do kind of a variety of things, but it's not always systematic. It's not always high in quality, but kids can get trapped in tier 2. And so you'll have these kids doing literally years of like a little bit of additional support. It's not enough to help them. Sometimes it's not effective at all. It's just a sort of the same thing that they had just gotten in their regular instruction that wasn't working for them anyway. And they'll do that for a couple of years, and then the student is 2 or 3 years below grade level, and it's just been caught. And so what's really missing there is emphasis on using data systematically and continuously. The second place that this shows up is even when kids have been identified with disabilities or kids are getting really intensive supports, people aren't always tracking the data carefully to see how fast progress is happening. And a lot of the work that I do, the projects I have in Connecticut right now, are about helping schools look more at data in two ways. One, to more quickly determine whether or not kids are making progress. So like really collecting weekly data on a very simple 1-minute measure, weekly collecting data. And then using those data to identify whether or not a kid is making progress. And then meeting on a regular basis, we usually recommend every 6 weeks, meet on a regular basis to look at those data and to make decisions. And then that second piece of it is making decisions based on really carefully interrogating what's happening in the data. If we look at recent spelling tests and audio recordings of the kid read, what's happening so we can make really specific, precise decisions about what to do for a student. I think that's the other piece of it. So that's where I think data use really can, I think, improve, is not only in terms of determining a kid needs help, but then even when we're giving that kid that help, that we're making sure that we are constantly determining is the improvement fast enough? And then if it isn't, what do the data tell us about what might be going on so we can change what we're doing? So I think that's probably the biggest area of need I think we have right now as a field.
Yeah, I love that you talked about that. And my own reflection, I was thinking a lot about, this oversimplification of the science of reading as a one size fits all approach. And I think that area talks that it's not, right, that you can individualize and that you can use data to leverage a lot of different instructional decisions to reach that kid. And, of course, there's some other things I think that the field is continuing to work on in terms of reaching all students, ensuring that, the science of reading reaches a lot of different areas of schools, especially those in the most vulnerable populations. But I think when you talk about data, my question, I think, for you is multifolded. So I'm just going to give myself a minute to think about this. But
sure.
I have questions about how you implement this in schools, how feasible it is, and where you start with that. Do you start with talking about systematic decisions that inform instruction. And so let's talk about the how and how feasible it is. So when let's say you have a school that's like, hey, we're not using data effectively. How do I do this? And how feasible is it to incorporate a system like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. There are a number of layers to answer this question. The first is, what is really necessary? So the reason I ask that question is there is a big question, do we need to collect data every week in order to make decisions, right? And the reason I recommend collecting data every week is that it's easiest to determine whether or not there's a trend in student performance when you collect weekly data every week. Because if you just collect data, say, every other week, right, then you're not getting as clear a picture because you can't kind of see the trend, after even, 4 weeks, you only have 2 data points. So you don't know, is this a trend? Is this just this passage was easier, this passage was harder to read? Because often we have kids like read very short passages for a minute in order to judge that. And so it can take like a month or more, or 2 months to determine whether or not there's an actual pattern. Whereas if you do it every week, it's easier to see a pattern. So that's why we recommend doing it on a weekly basis. The problem
Can I just ask a question about that? Are these just for struggling readers? Like, is this in adding to, let's say, like a progress monitoring system or a screening system, or is this for all students that you're tracking weekly data?
No, just for kids who are having serious difficulty.
Okay.
So yeah, because I mean, basically, like if we try to do this every week for every kid, like everyone would go crazy, right?
Yeah.
So no. So like basically, the recommendation is, and I believe that this is the right recommendation, is just do screening at least 3 times a year. So use some very simple measure. There are tons of these systems out there now to determine whether a kid is at risk of reading difficulty. And then for kids who score in a risk range, to do additional assessment to validate that the first measure is correct, that there actually is risk, and then to continually track students, either just kind of keep track of their data, make sure they're not falling further behind, or to provide some additional kind of support. But that's what most kids should get. And then this additional data collection for kids who need that other support. Yeah, that's what we're going to do just for a small subset of kids who are in need of a great amount of additional support. So no, we're not talking about doing this for everybody, just for that small group of kids. But it's still a lot, right? That there's no question that it presents a challenge because there are not enough hours in the day to do everything. That, if teachers have, let's say, if you even as 10 students, right? That's 10 students you have to evaluate every single week. And that doesn't immediately sound like a hard thing to do because I'm only asking them to do a minute long, pass with a student. But there's a lot of like mental effort that goes into like making that minute happen. You have to have the passages ready and photocopied, or if you're going to do physical copies, you have to have the system set up if you're doing it online. All that stuff has to be in place. Then you have to find the time. You got to send the other kids to do some independent work while you work with this kid, right? If you have 10 kids to do, you have to figure out a system for rotating through them. There's a lot of like mental energy and additional work that goes into finding that like 1 minute that I so casually, as someone who doesn't now do that all the time, say, it only takes a minute. Like I get that, like it doesn't really feel like it's just a minute. In fact, in a lot of ways, as I just described, it's not a minute. And then that's time people argue like away from all the other kids, like it's not instructional time, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Well, a couple of things. One, first, I still think you have to do it. Like full stop, you must have data. So, as much as I would like to say, it's like, yeah, no, it's fine. Like just, use your intuition, use, sort of just the spelling test you just administered or whatever. It's not enough. You need to have these outside data. These progress monitoring data I'm talking about should come from sometimes external validated system. And I think of it as like, it's maybe a little bit more than a sanity check. That's probably too light. But like, basically it's like telling you, do other data besides your own sort of internal data tell you, do they validate that what you think you're seeing is the right thing? And these external data might not be right either, but you need to have some way of kind of getting out of your head and being able to say to the universe, like, is what I think I'm seeing what actually is happening? Because I think it's very easy for us to get in the space of like, we're all so desperate for these kids to read that like it is, and I say this as someone who I feel did this, like it's easy for us to like believe things are improving when they're not, right? Or that they're improving adequately when they're really not, And I remember that like agonizing over how to score a kid on, this is such a silly example, like on a single word on an assessment, like, is it right or is it wrong? And they said it really slowly and like, yeah, probably it was technically right. But in my mind, I was like, do I score this a 1 because it's basically right? Or really, because I know it took the kid like 17 seconds to say it, even though it was finally right. Is that really, truly right? And I think, and then if I scored a 1, the kid's gotten a little better. If I scored a 0, they're not doing better. And, and like in my heart, trying to wrestle with like, is it really better or is that just me wanting it to be better? And I think that that's the problem we have a lot of times as educators is we just like, we really care so much about the kids and them making progress that we have this tendency to try to convince our brains that like progress is there, even if it isn't as there as we wish it were. So that's why I think that it's important to have this kind of external kind of like, measure that gets us out of our heads a little bit and, kind of pushes us to see things beyond, just the work that we did this week. And but this is not off track because what I'm saying is that it's hard to do this, okay?
Yeah.
But it's worth it. And so for the reason that I just said. However, it is so hard that I do think that as researchers, as on my side of things now, we need to find ways to make it easier for people to do this. We still are not there. And one way that I think we can do that is okay, so basically right now, I'm about to tell you, and you can decide if we want to cut this or not, because, I'm just going to go off a little bit for a second, Danielle. So, is that we don't yet know, like, what amount of data do we actually need, right? How many times do we need to collect those data on a weekly basis? Where we can say, you know what, we've got a good enough of a trend here. Let's start doing it every other week. Let's do it every 3 weeks. And then 3 weeks later, let's just like check in to make sure that like things are okay. Or we've done these standardized data for the last month. Things look okay. Now we're going to do this 6 weeks later, but we're going to use one of our regular weekly measures that we're doing to kind of do our sanity checks, right? So we're using kind of our own internal data weekly, and then every 6 weeks we're checking to make sure that our own sort of sense of things lines up, right? And actually that's what a lot of my schools do anyway. So after we leave on our project, we go back and we say, so how are things going? And they usually tell us like, we're still doing what you taught us to do, but we're doing it differently. And a lot of what they do is they do exactly what I said. They will collect the progress monitoring data weekly using the standardized measure as we recommend to start. And then when kids are doing well, they stop doing that and they use their own kind of like assessments. And then they occasionally check in, using the standardized measure. So because to them, it's like, listen, we think we've got this, right? The data show it. I, as a special education teacher or a reading interventionist, I'm seeing it. The classroom teacher is telling me they're seeing it too. I don't need to do that weekly assessment when now that we're kind of have this converging evidence that that's true, but they agree with me too, that like they need an external sanity check kind of. And so they're willing to do that as well. So anyway, I do think that as a field, as on the research side, on the development side, we do need to acknowledge even more than we do, because I do, that it's hard to do weekly data collection. It's hard to do this work. But I still believe in what I say when like, right now, it's the best that we have, and it's a good thing to do. And I don't have any objection if schools like do their own take on it. That's not what we do when we work on my research projects because the process
fidelity
work. But
capital F fidelity. Yeah. Sorry. Well, I have a couple of questions, actually, a couple of thoughts and questions to that. I think when you talk about like the frequency of data collection, I like what you talked about in terms of it's a systematic approach, right? That, I made a lot of connections to like research in human behavior and just like thought leaders in human behavior, like James Clear, right? We don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our systems. But, in terms of when you're talking with schools, right, you're leaving it up to their professional wisdom and that external data system to say, okay, maybe we can move off the once a week, which kind of brings it back to James Clear. It's not the intensity, it's the consistency of it, right? That maybe you're a little more intensive in the beginning, right? But that once you figure out those time points, as long as you're being consistent, I would imagine, you're continuing to monitor. I think that could be effective. Again, I don't know the research on it, so I don't want to say, yes, that could be effective. But from my own connection, maybe I would imagine that would be like kind of a good system for it. The other piece I wanted to talk about was when you were talking about schools and evaluating how frequently they want to assess beyond the once a week. This is why I love schools, because it's messy, right? Like there's not that clear approach of one size fits all. Like, there's a lot of things and decisions that need to go into it. But how much do you account for the quality of interventions and the type of interventions that students are receiving with those kind of decisions?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll just say to your point about schools being messy, it is like, it makes it really fun and really
Yeah.
exciting to do.
Yeah.
For like, I didn't start off as a researcher, I started off as a teacher. And so I have some, I can appreciate the messiness from that lens. But like as a researcher, what I can tell you is that like for research, it's maddening how variable schools are. It would be much better if everything were the same, but it's not. But I also love that about this. So, of course, now I've totally forgotten what it is you asked.
Well, I think the question, and it kind of leads into my next question too, is when you're using these data systems, right? You're tracking student gains through weekly or whatever time point that you're providing the data. Well, let's just say the weekly data, for example. How much of this is the quality of the intervention? And on separately, how can they be more informed in evaluating and implementing the programs that provide those instructional supports or interventions in addition to data collection?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the quality of instruction is everything essentially, right? So, and the quality of instruction depends on the quality of the program. And, you're stuck kind of with what you have sometimes, right? It's like you came to a school district and they use, program X, and that's what you have, then you have to work with it. And so if the programs aren't good, it's going to be harder to get good results. That is, though, why the data are really important and valuable, is that, the data give you a way to sort of like, I don't know, speak truth to power. And like, if things aren't going well, say to your administrator, like, listen, I'm doing the program the way it's designed. We're not getting results for this kid. Something needs to change. And so I think that, that's where data can be really powerful, is in helping make decisions about like, this program just may not be a good fit. It might not be a good program at all. So that was the only half what you're asking. What was the second thing you were asking?
And then how do educators become more informed then, and beyond the data, in evaluating and implementing these programs that align with the science of reading?
Yeah, well, one good thing about, if you're trying to find out more about how to implement best practices, one amazing thing is like the Read podcast and like all of the other, there's so many great things online now about how to do things, how to teach things. And then there are many programs that have free resources that are already available with them. And so I think when there are resources like that available online, take advantage of them. Use things that are out there. I think it's a great idea to rely on kind of trusted podcasters, like listen to the Read podcast, like listen to folks who have been doing this work and do good work. Follow on whatever social media platform you prefer, like thought leaders in this area. Like I like, there's always one that I make sure to follow, because she knows everything about developmental learning disorders, and she knows everything about reading in general and language in general. But so
you
find
can't
those
cut
people
out. But you said Tiffany Hogan was the one?
Yeah, Tiffany Hogan.
Yeah. Right when you said her name, the internet skipped. And so, but I was able to infer from your context clues and how much I love Tiffany Hogan as well, trusted resource on this work.
Yeah, knows everything about DLD and language in general and reading. Yep. That would be Tiffany Hogan. Yes, exactly. So find your trusted, folks like that, and follow what they're saying. Listen to them. I think as a teacher, you need to interrogate your own practice too. Like that's how I realized. I've told the story a lot of times. I won't say it again here, but like basically, I realized that things weren't working because I looked at my own instruction and realized like this isn't good enough, right? Like I knew that it should be better. And that's when I got training on the science of reading. And that's how when I saw kids could learn really fast, when I knew how to do it right, like that was how I realized it wasn't just me, but it took me saying to myself, there's something wrong here, right? It's a moment when you have to it's hard, but you got to you can listen to those other people to help you figure out how to change things for the better. So, I think as a teacher, like that's essential to moving forward in the work is like, interrogating your own thinking, like asking yourself the question, like, is this as good as it should be? Can I do better? Can we do better? Can I help this kid more than I am right now? And a lot of times the answer is no, we've got this. This is good. But sometimes it isn't. And that's when we have to like kind of, simply be the bigger people to ourselves and to say, listen, so this is not good enough, and then to seek out support, this is, and I will say, you can like write to some of these people. Like, I mean, I hesitate to say write to me as much as you want, because like email is already a problem, but like, I do think that like trusted, colleagues will always want to support you. So reach out to people when you're as an educator and you just sort of like, I know this isn't right, but I don't know what to do. Like reach out to somebody in the field. Like, I don't want to fill Danielle's inbox either, but like, I think those of us who do this work, like we do it because like we wanted, I mean, you're here, right, Danielle, because you wanted to get the word out so teachers knew what to do, right? I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, that speaks to what I think about on the daily basis. What keeps me up in the good ways, right? Of like the bad ways are like, oh my gosh, what about this myth and misapplication of the science of reading that I just saw? What? But then it's like, okay, we're just putting in the good work and we can go back to sleep and do the work in the morning, right? I like what you said, though. I think there are a lot of trusted advisors and experts out there, from individual researchers and university professors to groups like the Hub and FCRR. And I think you're all just this network, right, of just like amazing researchers that all collaborate and ask questions when maybe it's not your area of expertise. Like there's I think like I've been really interested in this translational science and interdisciplinary research for a while. And the science of reading is that example of that across decades. And the other piece, I think, when celebrating the work from a practitioner perspective, there's a lot of other knowledge brokers like the Reading League, right? Like I was actually at a school and they were using a certain structured literacy program that I wasn't that familiar with. And I went to the Reading League's website and found their evaluation toolkit. I forget what it is off the top of my head, the name of it, but I can post it. But there are people doing that work and folks doing that work that I think, you're not alone operating in the silo. So I really appreciate you saying that. My last question for you, and this podcast sped through faster than the last 5 years. I mean, obviously, because this is only 40 minutes, but you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like where is time? But from your perspective, what is one thing that we should be focused in on the research or in the areas of instruction in the year ahead? And we didn't really talk about dyslexia. If you can talk a little bit about dyslexia in the last few minutes, I'd love that. Tim Odegaard was the editor of an amazing Annals of Dyslexia edition this last year. A number of researchers wrote papers on it. So I'm just curious, what do you think we should be focusing on, and where do you see research and education going in the next year?
Yeah, well, so the point about, dyslexia, the issue you're referencing is been a lot about like what's the definition of dyslexia, and where researchers have been thinking about, and other stakeholders have been thinking about, is like, do we need to change it all, the way we frame the definition of dyslexia? And so I'm on a committee of the International Dyslexia Association. We're working on that now to try to see if we can adjust the definition in some ways. It's not going to change fundamentally, but there's a big recognition about there's kind of these factors, and like Hugh Katz and Jakob Petcher have written a lot about this, about these factors that are protective factors and factors that can make dyslexia worse. And so they talked about kind of this constellation of factors, like this kind of a seesaw effect of like what makes it more likely you're going to get dyslexia and what can prevent, what are more preventive factors. And so it's kind of weaknesses and resilience framework. I forget what they call it exactly, but
risk and resilience.
What is it?
Risk and resilience.
Thank you. That's it. Risk and resilience model. And so, that model I think is a really good one to think of, that like there are going to be factors that are going to make it less likely that you get dyslexia, even if you have a predisposition based on family history and so on. And so I think that's going to be a big thing. In terms of, research in the next year, I think a big area is like something called set for variability, which I don't have enough time to go into. But basically, it's about like that moment when you're like, wait, that's not quite right. And your brain like figures out what the right word is. You say like, if it's fan, right? That moment when you go from fatten to fan, that's the moment we're talking about. That is, there's something going on there. Researchers, I've done some of this work. Some of my colleagues, Florida State and other places, have done a lot of this work, Australia too, and England. And so people have been trying to figure out, like, is there something unique going on here? It appears that there is. And people have been trying to see, there's a recent paper by Rob Savage and colleagues in the UK, and they seem to think that we can actually improve people's ability to kind of like turn the light on like that, right? And that if we can do that, make that capacity better, the ability to kind of like recognize, oh, right, that's what the word is, even when we're not quite right, that can make a big difference. So I think that's something that's going to be like, that's one of the next things I think is going to be to see how we can leverage that, because that's one thing that, I know resonate with people on the podcast. So like there are those kids where if you say, listen, the sounds are they cannot turn into fan, because fan and are not the same, right? The A sound in the a sound in fan is and, not right? But it's close enough that you should be able to turn it on. But some kids can't. And so trying to figure out how we can help kids like turn on, make it easier for them to make the connection between something that's almost right but not quite to the word in their brain, the entry in the lexicon. I think that's a really big one. So I think that's going to be an exciting area, going forward. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
So we kind of spoke to this earlier, but I want to ask, like, when you reflect on the last 5 years, like, what makes you really excited about the impact that you've had? And then where are you excited for the podcast to go in the next year?
Oof, that's a really good question. I love being asked questions. This is exciting. You're speaking to my value of curiosity. I think that we started the podcast as a way to fit the need, and particularly with the need I was having of how do I access the research more seamlessly? Like, how can I talk to researchers in a way that, I read their paper, I've listened to their professional development, but let's break this down. Let's get into the nitty gritty of some of this work. And, it came at a time at a school where I had incredible support from both our former head of school, Dr. Jay Russell, and our current head of school, Jamie Williamson, where they were like, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's reach more people, right? Like, you have this question, let's do it. And so it really was this like small, mighty little venture that happened pre-pandemic that has gone so much further than I thought it would. And what's really interesting is it immersed me in this different type of skill set of like, you should have seen me in some of like the not February, I guess it was more of like April or May 2020, where I was in my New York City apartment trying to figure out how to best fit acoustics and what mic do I buy? Like, no idea, right? But I will say that it's really opened up the world into being able to talk to researchers like yourself directly, and then to hear the voices and be able to synthesize the research more effectively. I always say this is like the little spark to the fire, right? That I learned something new, and then it immerses me into a world of research where then I can be more effective. And then, I think from the Institute perspective, we've grown so much. We are providing professional development across the country to teachers in elementary school to high school. Actually, I've been doing a lot of work with high school teachers recently, and it's been a lot of fun to learn about their context, right? Like yourself, systems level approaches and change is something that's really interesting to me. And when I can learn more from people doing the boots on the ground work, it helps to inform how we make change in context and hopefully how we scale change. And so that, I think every year I'm always more interested in learning about change management and how we guide folks throughout the system to just be better for their kids and to serve all kids. I'm really excited about policy. Kathy Hochul just passed a law. Now I'm drawing the blank of what was the actual law, but it was sponsored by actually our friend Bobby Carroll, related to it was more access to neuropsych reports and dyslexia screening and things like that. And so I'm just really excited by the movement. I have been so grateful to be part of this actual movement itself and to do my little part in this work. So I appreciate you asking that, because it's really a nice time to reflect as we think about the last 5 years and how quickly it's gone and where we go in the future. So change management, systems change is my bread and butter. I hope we can continue to do that work in the future. Yeah.
Good answer.
Thank you. Thank you. I did well on that one. That you turned the podcast host on me, huh?
I did just a little bit. I did.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts, Dr. Kearns, from you that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
No, I think, I do have a thought. Stay the course, sort of.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's say if you're on a course that seems tough, stay the course. I think the winds are buffeting us from all sides these days, right? I think there are a lot of things are going to get messier. Things are going to get uglier, unfortunately. And I mean this even in our own field. And I think, though, that the work that has been happening over the past several years is good work. Don't let them stop you, be scientific about it. Self-interrogate. Like, I think those are critical principles. But when you know that you're onto something, but it's not quite there yet, stay the course. Like, don't let them get you down. And so just have, if my voice means anything to anybody at all, who knows if it does, but if it does, if you listen to me and think he does know, it's like, say, I'm telling you that if you're onto something and you've been listening to science and you think you're on the right track, but you're not sure, and people are giving you a hard time, stay the course and do your best, and probably you're onto something. But pay attention to the data is the other piece of it, right? Stay the course, but check the data. I guess that's a good one. Stay the course, but check the data. I like that. That's what I'm going to end with.
There's a quote that Jay Russell always puts in his presentations: "In God we trust, but everyone else bring data." I think it's like an Edward Demings quote or something. Yeah. And then he always had like the Star Trek data like go across the screen. I think that's so powerful because it underscores how powerful data is, right? And I think if we learned anything from this podcast and the science of reading, data is the thing that's going to chart our courses.
Yeah.
Appreciate
that. Stay
the
course, but check the data.
Yeah. Dr. Kearns, thank you for being on the Read podcast again. This was so fun.
It was so fun. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for everything you've done for the field. I don't think the impact of this work is, I think hopefully you know it because I'm sure you get emails and so on, but if you don't, you should. People talk about it all the time.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you all to our readers for tuning into this episode of the Read podcast. To learn more about Dr. Kearns or for more from this episode, you can visit our episode pages at readpodcast.org, where you can also access all of the experts from the past 5 years of episodes. I continuously strive to connect with you and learn from inspiring leaders and advocates in research and education. So if you have any thoughts, questions, or ideas of topics and speakers, you can reach out to me via email at info@readpodcast.org. It's been so nice to hear a lot of your feedback and questions and just, readers out in the community and the world. And we are still waiting on Antarctica. I know I'll get an email from someone there as well. So I also invite you to subscribe, and share the Read podcast with your friends and colleagues, and also like or follow the Windward Institute team. We're doing some great work here in New York in our small and mighty team, and we hope that you engage with us in the years to come. And so with that, Dr. Kearns, I always like to have my expert guests say the final words, which is until next time, readers. So will you delight us with that final word?
Until next time, readers.